welcome to the program, and welcome to part 2 of my conversation with American University's Fulton Armstrong. As a reminder, he is a senior fellow at American University's Center for Latin American and Latino Studies. He's also an adjunct professor at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. He followed Latin American affairs for almost 30 years in a number of U.S. government positions. He worked and studied in Europe, Asia, and Latin America for numerous years. From 2008 to 2011, he served as a senior professional staff member responsible for Latin America on the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Prior to this, Armstrong served at the U.S. Interests section in Havana, Cuba, and subsequently as senior analyst at the CIA. He served 2 terms as the Director for Inter-American Affairs at the National Security Council from 1995 to 97, and again from 1998 to 1999, between which he was Deputy NIO for Latin America. In part 1 of our conversation in the previous episode, we spent a significant amount of time talking about the migration crisis emanating from Latin America and causing challenges throughout the Americas, including into the United States. We discussed some of the push and pull factors that have driven people to leave their home countries and have triggered this crisis. And we also talked about U.S. policy in the region and how it has both contributed to and exacerbated some of these issues, but also how the United States has been challenged to respond in more recent years as the number of immigrants coming into the United States from this region has significantly increased. We talked about the role that violence plays, weak institutions, even climate change as drivers of this migration. So if you missed that episode, I encourage you to go back and listen to that, but you don't have to. These 2 episodes with Fulton are distinct and they stand alone in terms of the topics we discussed, because in this conversation, which we are about to present to you, we now shift our focus from the issues of domestic policies in Latin America to foreign policy. And Latin America doesn't get talked about a lot in the context of geopolitics around the world, not necessarily the first place you think of when breakouts of war happen in Eastern Europe, or when violence rises in the Middle East, or when there are trade disputes across the Pacific, and yet it is a vital area of the world. Strong economies in places like Brazil, important exporters of energy and food, and quite frankly, for both the United States and the Europeans, as well as for the Chinese, geopolitically significant in their location in the world. So we thought, who better than talking to Fulton, an expert on this region, about all aspects of foreign affairs, foreign policy, from the perspective of Latin American governments and the societies that they are responsible for. In this particular interview, we spent some time talking about the situation in Venezuela, which, as of the time of the recording of this program, we are just coming off of a very contentious and disputed election, which appears to not have been free and fair. And it would appear that as of the recording of this program, Nicolas Maduro has retained power despite the overwhelming evidence that he has been voted out of office. And we spend some time in this episode talking about the region's reaction to that, the United States' reaction to that. But then we go beyond. We talk about the region and how it perceives foreign policy issues ranging from the war in Ukraine to the conflict in the Middle East between the Israelis and the Palestinian organizations and terror groups in that part of the world. We also talk about China, Russia, the influence of these countries in this part of the world, and how the South Americans in general view their place in the Western Hemisphere and the relationship that they would like to have with the United States. And we also discussed this topic and this idea of the global South. Is it a real thing? Do the Brazilians see themselves in the same organization as a country like India or South Africa? Or is it a construct that we have to think about in a different way? So these are some of the things that we talked about in part 2 of my conversation with Fulton Armstrong, which I present to you now. So let's shift our attention to some foreign policy questions here, and we'll take these again from the Latin American perspective. I'm going to start with As we're recording this program, we're just past the elections in Venezuela. That as of this moment, there is still a significant dispute. It appears from independent sources that it was likely a disputed, at the minimum, election, but in all likelihood, the opposition legitimately won. But the government at this point is not interested in stepping aside. And so there is a significant international discussion about how to go forward. Now, what I find interesting about this, and this will be timely, hopefully, months from now, as people may be listening to this for the first time, there is some coordination, it seems, between nations in the region, namely Brazil, Colombia, Mexico. The United States has been an active participant in some of this, but these three countries that have ties with the Venezuelan government are starting to speak up potentially in a way that we have not seen before. Now, how do you view this election and the challenges Venezuela faces going forward, no matter how this turns out, and how the neighborhood, so to speak, can step in to help in a way that it just has not seemingly in the recent, let's just say the last 10 years, but even longer than that, as Venezuela's economy collapsed and its population scattered, and many of these countries didn't take a significant step to try to stem that. And that's my perception. You correct me if that's wrong,
No,
but
it's a
it's an
correct
interesting
perception.
it's
It's
an
a correct.
interesting moment as we see these countries now seem to take the issue more seriously and make their voices heard that they are expecting a different direction.
You're very perceptive on that. I think that they're taking action, and it's positive action, in part to keep the Venezuelan government from doing something stupid, but also to keep the U.S. government from doing something stupid, because this is a movie that they've seen before, and that is a, an election, the legitimacy of which there are significant indicators that are subject to challenge, legitimate reasons to challenge, etc. And these three presidents, who are the two big guys, at least demographically, the two big guys, and a very important neighbor, Colombia, which traditionally has badgered Venezuela, but under the current president has been quite a positive player. President Petro has had a good dialogue with the Venezuelans and stuff. They said, let's us take some leadership here so that the gringos don't come in and mess it up. And they said, first of all, let's get the facts. And it's really quite surprising how fast the opposition produced the actas. They're called the actas, or the printouts of the voting the voting booth, or the voting station results. Some of them were really, really fast. Some people would say even suspiciously fast, but they did produce them. And so the three presidents said, before we reach judgments, because this is a highly, highly questionable sort of thing, let's give the government time to present its version of the actas and put them side by side and stuff. But this is a movie that they've seen before. The U.S. government has already proclaimed Maduro, President Maduro's opponent, the victor of the elections. They're calling him now President-elect Gonzalez, the opposition candidate. They're calling him the victor. This is a movie we've seen before because we previously, under President Trump, we declared Juan Guaido the president of, of Venezuela. This was a one-term member of the parliament who had been chosen as one of four in a rotating presidency of the opposition, who had then we designated, when he was the president of the opposition, we designated him the president of Venezuela, and it was an utter failure. We gave him the keys to the vault. We gave him the ownership of Citgo. We gave him all of these things. We gave him the embassy here in Washington. We gave him the gold in London. We gave him everything. And his presidency was feckless. It lacked legitimacy, but he did have the support in the beginning of what we called the Lima Group, which was about 50 different countries. So we thought, there's the legitimacy, 50 countries. But the problem was he didn't have the legitimacy in the country, in Venezuela. He was a pretty boy. He had a pretty long-term partner with whom he had a child, very pretty child, and stuff like that. But he had no traction as a politician in the country. He tried to orchestrate at least one publicly acknowledged coup attempt, and of which he was the leader and stuff, and it failed utterly. The United States then was backing a loser, and slowly we backed off. We now have jumped the gun while the three presidents, the three powerful presidents of the hemisphere, have said, wait, 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 let's look at the facts. We've already jumped the gun. We haven't begun to call him President Gonzalez, but we now have declared him president elect. What have we done to them? Will we be able to form another Lima group? What does this mean? The government is beginning to show the actas. They've also begun critiquing the opposition's version of the actas and showing the number of them that don't have signatures, that they're suspicious, etc., etc. I don't know. I personally would have hoped that the U.S. had been a little bit more disciplined, allowed a little bit more time to let Latin Americans and Venezuelans do it first. As long as it's generally peaceful, let them do it first. But we jumped the gun. It's a movie we've seen before. And the
If
outcome it usually is not very positive.
Yeah, it had that feeling that this might be the time that the region figures out a solution that can work. Um, but the U.S. would need to sort of step back as big brother, so to speak, and let that happen, and that did not. Now, what's also interesting is how quickly America's rivals in the world rapidly came out to congratulate Maduro on a new term. Certainly, Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, all of the normal adversaries of the West were very quick to congratulate and try to legitimize the Venezuelan official results, as they call them. Now, how do you perceive those countries in Latin America? It seems like their policy has historically been to annoy the United States and remind us that they're on our doorstep. But some have said that the Chinese are more serious about building long term economic ties, that they're not necessarily looking to have the same influence that they have perhaps in Africa, but nonetheless, that is a more serious foreign policy outreach than what we have seen historically. What is your view on, well, any of those countries, but specifically China?
You're correct. It's to annoy. It's to basically mock. Of course, they're going to do a statement congratulating Maduro to do it. In the case of Cuba, for example, it's very interesting. They referred to brother Nicolas Maduro, the president, and that's because if you look closely at what Cuban statements were during normalization, they toned that stuff down because they really want a relationship with us. But we have tightened sanctions, including under Biden, we have significantly tightened sanctions on Cuba, forbidding, for example, Europeans to go to Cuba without suffering the penalty of what's called ESTA, the ESTA visa waiver thing, which is very important to Europeans because if you don't get ESTA and you want to come to the United States, you have to go and apply for a visa. And so that was a huge sanction that the Biden people put against Cuba based on a Trump decision that they refused to undo. It's complicated, but believe me on that. So those sort of statements of solidarity are cute and to basically annoy. And China's interest is economic, it's trade, it's not subversive. They don't want to put in military bases. They don't even want to put in these famous signals intelligence bases that some people in the American fringes claim that they're trying to build in Cuba and stuff. But frankly, as I said earlier, if China can get for a dime what maybe would cost somebody else $1 in Latin America, they would. They've traditionally had relationships in the hemisphere. But as their industries move forward, especially with lithium, which is produced quite extensively in Bolivia, Chile, and I think Argentina is also a very big producer, and copper, of course, from Chile, they would be fools not to try to lock in long term contracts and those things. Just because we're sitting on our thumbs doesn't mean that they have to be sitting on their thumbs as well. So, good. I mean, that's the way it is. Because we don't invest doesn't mean that they can't invest, does it? That's just the way the world works.
Now, the other dynamic that's played out in international affairs has been the emergence of the concept of the global south, of which there is some rivalry over who's going to lead that. But maybe nowhere has it been more apparent than in the Middle East crisis of this last year between the Israelis, the Palestinians, and some of the neighboring countries in the region, and specifically the war in Gaza. It has been notable how few Latin American countries have come out on the United States position. Really, few countries in the world have taken the U.S.'s strong position in absolute support of the state of Israel. But it's been interesting to see the Latin Americans try to basically avoid as much as possible getting involved, and where they do get involved, they're more sympathetic, I think, to the cause of the Palestinians. I think that's a fair statement. But they know the world's watching, and they know that there's sort of a to some degree a keeping of score of who's saying what and how vocal they're being. So let's take the two parts of that question. One, your view of this concept of a global south. Does Latin America see it that way, or is that a construct of academics? And then number two, in the context of that, how these countries are thinking about these huge international issues like the Middle East, and what position they should be taking to either be helpful, be mediators, or just stay out of it.
I think the global south is a useful analytical construct. In political terms, I'm not sure that most people in this global south wake up in the morning and say, let's go out and fight for the global south. I think that insofar as there are stronger voices coming from the global south, that they get their voices, they support it. Most South Americans don't think like Brazilians and don't say go Brazil, go and represent us. They want their own voice at the table, and so they will seek that voice. And then on issues like Israel, it cuts through a lot of different societies, cuts through a lot of racial things. South and Central and Caribbean friends will ask people like me and probably ask people like you, saying, "What is it about Israel that you guys have these blinders?" In this last week, for example, you welcome Netanyahu here. They stand up and applaud him in the U.S. Congress, and he tells things that just are factually incorrect about the way they've been prosecuting the war and about fatalities and things. But they also will say, 30,000 people, this is a month or two ago, 30 or 2 months ago, 30,000 people are killed, and you guys aren't outraged. But then 7 white people are killed delivering meals by precision missiles that the US provided Israel. And suddenly the White House is engaged in outrage and said, oh, this is too much and stuff. They see it as a little bit of a racial issue. And they say, what's wrong with you Americans? 30,000 Palestinians, yes, some fighters and some Hamas people that we don't like and we will never like and stuff, but come on. And you don't have to blow up an entire apartment building because there might be a tunnel underneath it that might have a couple of this, that, or the other thing. And so they wonder, how come we've suspended the that used to be considered that beautiful North American logic. So in that way, maybe the global South feels that they do have a little bit of a corner on the truth, and that they believe it's it's something worth protecting.
So we don't necessarily have a Cold War dynamic with a Soviet Union and a United States that are super, powerful, and each can offer this part of the world something. But there clearly are options. If you sit in Argentina, if you sit in Mexico, if you sit in Chile, certainly the United States geographically makes a lot of sense. You're going to want to keep relationships with them. But how are they weighing, in your view, in your analysis, how are they weighing the relationships that they can and should be forming with America's rivals? Countries like China, which do have a lot to offer economically, even countries like Russia that are heavily sanctioned, would they be willing to do business with those countries if it's to their benefit, even if that risks a confrontation economically with the United States?
I think yes. I think they've already proven that if the U.S. doesn't want to do business, they're happy to do business with other people if those other people can pay. And they've shown that with China. Russia in trade in the Western Hemisphere really hasn't been a major player. But if Russia came in, they would say, yeah, we'll deal with you. But the China example shows quite clearly that they're not going to do it. On the personal and policy side, there is, and I don't want to insult any South Americans or Central Americans who are listening, there is a little bit of residual post colonial thing here, that they have a strong national identity. They somewhat have a sub regional identity, like Mercosur has a sub regional identity down around Brazil, the Southern Cone, Chile, sort of thing. But their regional identity as South Americans is very weak.
Hmm.
And when that makes it really easy for us, the United States, to bilateralize almost anything. If we see them headed in a way at the UN or even at the Organization of American States that we don't like, we bilateralize and we then divide them and conquer them. And we also use a cultural thing with them that yes, some of them, like the Colombians, have a little bit of a European focus. They like to send their children to Europe to study, and it's quite interesting that when you go to Bogota and you see these people that speak really quite excellent English, but it's with a British accent. They want their children because they think that the British culture is superior. Your British listeners will probably agree with them. The British culture is superior to American culture, and British English, of course, is superior to American and stuff. But most of them, access to U.S. and being part of the American, meaning U.S. culture, which of course is offensive to many people of the center left and the left, that we call ourselves Americans because they're Americans too, but that the United States and access to the US and being able to come to the United States and send their kids to university here and at least come up to shop and to do tourism is really important. They don't want to feel isolated and all of that. There are in some countries, especially in Central America, we used to joke that each family, when they had a lot of kids, each family would have, as you know, someone in the military, someone in the bureaucracy, someone in the church, and they would have a gringo handler. And the gringo handler would come up to the university in the US for the sole purpose of learning how to speak perfect English and handle the gringos that we would send down there, whether for business or for diplomacy or something like that. And so there is this residual idea to want to have a relationship with the colonial lords, if you will, the colonial power. And that's us. And it's funny how that clicks in sometimes, that the desire to be pleasing to us does give us a lot of influence in the hemisphere.
So, a last question as we look to the future here. Let's just look over the next coming years. We don't know how the United States election is going to turn out, so that will certainly have an impact on Latin American policy. But what are some of the trends that you're watching for in the geopolitics of the region, maybe in the economic situation of the region? What should our listeners be scanning the headlines for in the coming years here? Are there any particular countries that you have a real focus on? Any economic trends, political trends? Anything that's really got your interest that you as an expert in the region are paying attention to that we should be keeping top of mind?
I don't see a bunch of wars and the traditional threats there. What I see is if I were going to say one thing to watch would be institutionality. Are the institutions in these countries going to be credible in the future? Can they deliver? And we already see examples in Mexico, for example, the President AMLO and his successor Claudia Sheinbaum, they are from a non traditional party. In the case of El Salvador, Bukele is from a non traditional party. There's a rejection of non traditional parties through much of Latin America. And is that good or is that bad? Does that mean new blood or does that mean we're going to gravitate toward, does it mean new blood and that the old parties are going to say, whoa, we have to change. We have to become more transparent. We have to become more accountable. We have to become more this, more progressive, more this. Or does it mean it's going to be coming back more toward leadership by personality and concentration on people rather than institutions? And is there going to be a weakening of checks and balances? Because it might work in the executive systems to have a strong person. But what do you do in the Congresses and the parliaments? And what do you do in the bureaucracies if loyalty becomes to one person on the executive side? I find that really troubling. I would much prefer that the parties clean themselves up and modernize. And I'm not yet seeing it in the case of either Mexico or El Salvador. That would be one key thing. The global warming is going to be a huge shock to a lot of these countries because their ability to deal with the sorts of changes that are necessary to accommodate both the all of the various dynamics, the economic, political stresses that global warming is going to put on, they're going to have to start building new infrastructure. There are cities in Latin America, as there are in the United States, that are going to go underwater in things. There are cities that are going to need new forms of water supplies. We're losing glaciers in Peru, where they're going to need to find solutions, and that are going to require political consultation dynamics that they don't have right now. I think migration, of course, internal and external migration is going to be a thing. But I also would like to think whether the United States is going to learn how to deal with this hemisphere and learn with this region as a more equal partner, the way that some of our presidents in the past have tried to do, and whether we can make it real, that we can deal with them. We can maybe even take what has been a really tired and ineffectual organization like the Organization of American States and vitalize it into a dynamic, consultative body that brings information rather than old, tired thoughts and litmus tests to the front to solve problems.
Are there any, just given the history of the region, when weak institutions have at times given way to strongmen dictators, are there any countries that you see that are at risk of slipping down that path again in the short term?
In the short term, meaning a couple of years,
Hmm.
perhaps not, but yes, over the longer term, if the traditional parties and the governments and the elites don't learn how to deal with the governments, because that's a real problem, to get the elites to stop resorting to corruption, because we can blame government corruption, but look, the governments don't corrupt themselves. There's someone who is corrupting them. And if the elites don't learn how to deal with government and respect government and hands off of government and let processes move forward, I can see, yes, that the strong man, the problems are going to get to a certain point where only a strong man is going to be able to, quote, convince the electorate that they can solve the problems. And you're then going to lose a lot of baby with the bathwater.
It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you for giving us so much of your time. If people would like to learn more about you or your work, are you active on any of the social media channels? Do you have a blog that you'd like to promote? Anything you'd like to share with our listeners?
No, I don't, because of my background in intelligence. I've never really decided to go out with those things, but people can find me at American University or and that I will respond to emails.
Excellent. Then we will make sure that the link to that is available in the description of this podcast. Fulton, thank you so much for taking this time to speak with us.
Great. Thanks, Brian.
One of the reasons that I felt it was important to spend a couple of episodes this season understanding Latin American geopolitics, understanding the view from Latin America, understanding where their place is in the geopolitical order is because I sensed something was changing. It's an instinct, it's a gut feeling, it's not really all that informed by conversations with any sort of leaders or business leaders in the region, but it's that sense of being an observer of geopolitics and noticing that Latin America in general seems to be placing some bets just in case things don't go well in their relationship with the United States. So you heard some of the questions I asked Fulton about the view of Latin American governments towards a sanctioned country like Russia that's public enemy number one of the United States government and, frankly, the governments of Western Europe as well. Their view of their trade relationships with a country like China, their view of the crisis in the Middle East between the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the Arab states, their view of, I didn't get into this specifically, but their view of pariah states like North Korea or Iran, how they're willing to interact and engage with those countries on a basis of neutrality. I think it's very interesting to see that these countries have made very clear that they want an alternative to the United States because they don't trust having all their eggs in that basket. The long-term policy of the U.S. has been all over the place, zigzaggy, as Fulton said, sort of up and down. And while there would be a preference to have close relations with the U.S., so close that formalized alliances, potentially even defense alliances, would make a lot of sense, the idea that the United States has such a strong alliance with its North Atlantic partners in NATO, in Europe, and doesn't have a similar strong, well-known alliance in Latin America is pretty interesting, given that this is so much closer to home in so many ways, and given the potential of both security benefits as well as trade relations and free movement of goods, services, and people. It's interesting that the U.S. has a much closer formalized relationship across the Atlantic Ocean with its Western European partners than it does with those who are just on the other side of the border in Mexico or on the other side of the Gulf of Mexico in Latin America, Central America, South America, the Caribbean. All of this to say that you can tell that these regions, the countries in this region, they're looking at the just-in-case scenario. They want to know what happens if the U.S. truly disengages from international trade relationships, from international geopolitical commitments, from foreign policy commitments. They want to make sure that if you're sitting in a capital in Brazil or Argentina or Colombia, that not only are you thinking about relations in your neighborhood, but you're thinking about potentially America's rivals. And if the U.S. isn't going to play an active role in your part of the world, then perhaps you turn to China for things that you would have otherwise turned to the U.S. for. Perhaps you're willing to do business with a sanctioned country like Russia, even if it pisses off the United States Embassy in your capital. Perhaps you're willing to flirt with business relations with a country like Iran, despite its state sponsoring of terrorism in the region, including targeting U.S. troops in countries like Iraq. Perhaps it means you're willing to have controversial relationships with countries openly hostile to the United States, well, governments that are openly hostile to the U.S., like those in Nicaragua, like those in Venezuela, like those in Cuba. Perhaps you are preparing for a world in which the United States is not as much of a factor, and whether you'd like to be engaging with those countries or not, for the benefit of your own people, you feel a need to do so. So when I look at Latin America and I think about the issues that are being faced in those countries, they're not really that different from issues being faced in other democracies. If anything, the part of the world is much more stable than it has been historically, despite challenges, particularly in Venezuela. But it is a country, it is a region, I should say, as I said at the end of the last episode, that has so much hope and so much promise. There are so many compelling stories and businesses and leaders and communities. There's every reason to believe that Latin America could have a renaissance economically, socially, culturally, that propels it to a top producer in the world, that allows it to have the kind of economic power collectively that the European Union has, or certain countries in Southeast Asia when they act collectively have. But the challenge here is, as much hope and optimism as there is, the force that is most likely to bring those together and to help realize that potential is the superpower in their own backyard, the United States. If the U.S. is not interested in doing that, the likelihood is that the individual countries that have economies of note are likely to simply expand their trade relationships with many of America's rivals, deepening the challenges the U.S. may have in retaining its top spot in the world economically, and allowing countries like China, like Russia, like Iran to have closer relations closer to America's border, which can cause security challenges in the future and potentially difficult conversations between the American government and those in Latin America. So as we wrap this episode and as we wrap this topic, I want to leave you with two things to consider. And these are the things that I'm thinking about. Number one, there's no doubt in my mind that the governments of Latin America would prefer, if at all possible, to work with the United States. But under what circumstances? And what policy would allow the U.S. to exert significant geopolitical influence without returning to some sort of a uncomfortable colonial engagement? I think the presidential candidates should have to answer these questions as we think about who's going to be the next president of the United States. I also think a lot of other political leaders in the U.S., including those who represent the U.S. in international organizations, should have to answer for that. There has not been a meaningful foreign policy from the U.S. to answer how they would better engage with their Latin American partners. But the other thing I want to leave you with is, what about the Europeans? We have this strong alliance across the Atlantic between the United States, Canada, and their North Atlantic partners in Europe, and yet we don't see a similar alliance with Latin America and the United States. But why don't we see more European countries who have historical ties, both colonial and more modern economic ties to Latin America? Why is it never in the top 20 things that is ever talked about in the United Kingdom, in France, in Germany, in Spain? These are countries that could have a significant positive influence on a more equal level with their Latin American counterparts, and yet they seem very hesitant to do so. There should be a policy that the Europeans have towards expanding trade relationships and civilian relationships with the countries of Latin America as well. So whether it's the United States or Europe, I think it's important that we hear from all of specifically the open, free, democratic societies of the world, which share that in common with Latin America for the most part, and how they are going to deepen quality and equal relations with these countries that they share a lot in common with, and yet so often seem to ignore. And I simply leave you with this warning: any part of the world that is ignored by liberal democratic forces is prone to slip towards autocratic and authoritarian forces. So make no mistake, if the democracies of the world take a step back from supporting like-minded governments, there are going to be other forms of government that try to support and try to back up more authoritarian voices to make that part of the world look a lot less like the United States and Western Europe and look a lot more like Moscow, like Beijing, and like Tehran. I thank you so much for listening to this program, and we're not done with the Latin American topic. We actually have another episode coming up specifically on the country of Brazil, because when you talk about Latin America, you can't talk about it without talking about its largest by land and economic output countries like Brazil. And there's so many aspects to that, and Brazilian politics is fascinating. So we will cover that topic over the next couple of episodes. But for today, I thank you all for listening to this program. I invite you to subscribe to this show if you have not done so already. You can find us on any of your favorite podcast platforms. You can also just subscribe to us on YouTube. That's an easy way to guarantee that every new upload gets sent an alert directly to you. You can find all of my archives, the show notes, and all of our old episodes on my website, brianjmatos.com. Of course, we post on our social media channels as well. And if all else fails, you can always reach out to me by email if you'd like to get in touch, info@brianjmatos.com. Thank you all for listening. Look forward to talking to you again on our next episode. And until then, I invite you all and encourage you all to stay curious.